Hi, I'll be introducing Dr. Daniel Cobb. Daniel M. Cobb is Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research and teaching focus on American Indian history since 1887, political activism, and ethno-historical methods. Since joining the Department of American Studies at UNC, Dr. Cobb has regularly served as coordinator of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies major concentration and minor, and is currently director of undergraduate studies. He has served as a counselor of the American Society for Ethnohistory, the associate editor of Ethnohistory, and on the editorial board of Journal of Civil and Human Rights. Cobb's first book, Native Activism in Cold War America, won the inaugural Labrador Center American Indian National Book Award in 2009. His other publications include the edited works Beyond Red Power in 2007 and Memory Matters in 2011, a revised and expanded fourth edition of William T. Hagen's classic work American Indians in 2013, and Say We Are Nations, Documents of Politics and Protest in Indigenous America since 1887, which is today, right? Just came out. He is in the process of completing a biography about the life and times of Ponca activist Clyde Warrior, a central figure in the American youth movement of the 1960s. A passionate teacher, Cobb integrates the ideals of engaged scholarship, the student as scholar, and the fusion of teaching and research in classes ranging from introductory surveys of American Indian history to graduate seminars on ethnohistory. In 2012, he received the Tanner Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching at the University of North Carolina. Dr. Cobb also values public engagement. In 2005, he served as program director for a series of public events at Miami University devoted to Indian politics and culture. In 2007, he created and installed an exhibit on the life and legacy of Clyde Warrior for the Ponca tribe of Oklahoma's Clyde Warrior Memorial Building. In 2010, he co-organized a public symposium entitled Memory Matters at Miami University Humanities Center. And over the past few years, he has also been involved in teaching American history and other professional development programs for public school teachers in Ohio, Louisiana, South Carolina, and North Carolina. Dr. Cobb has received fellowships and grants from the American Philosophical Society, Organization of American Historians, Friends of the Princeton University Library, Morris K. Udall Archives, and the Newberry Library, the Carl Albert Center for Congressional Research and Studies, the Humanities Center at Miami University, and the Institute for the Arts and Humanities University Research Council, and William R. Cannon Jr. Charitable Trust at the University of North Carolina. He is not busy. We are very honored to have Dr. Cobb with us here today. Please join me in welcoming him to UWT.
All right, thank you so much. I'd like to begin by thanking Assistant Chancellor Sharon Parker for inviting me to be here with you this evening. I want to thank Michael Toole, the Chancellor, and his partner. I also would like to acknowledge Hank Adams and William Hensley that I'm really delighted to have a chance to spend some time with this evening, and thanks to everyone for being here. It's truly a distinct honor to be here on Puyallup land to celebrate the life and work of Sandy Osawa. With the brief time that I have, I'd like to explain why I consider Sandy to be among the greatest of one of Native America's greatest generations. The generation of American Indians who came of age during the 1950s and the 1960s and whose impact has been felt across the 20th and indeed into the 21st centuries. Sandy's generation not only met the challenges of an era marked by extraordinary peril, but managed also to establish the foundation for a future filled with promise. One of the ways that Sandy has done that is, of course, through film. In fact, I'd imagine that many, perhaps most of you, are familiar with Sandy primarily through the documentaries that she's made with her husband, Yasu, with whom she formed Upstream Productions in 1980. So I'd like first to speak to the importance of Sandy's many documentary films that she has so eloquently put it, tell stories of, for, and about tribal communities. Consider, for instance, her masterful Lighting the Seventh Fire, a film that compellingly details the Ojibwe struggle during the 1980s and 1990s to protect treaty-guaranteed reserved rights to spearfish in Wisconsin. Sandy's ability to draw viewers into the story, to force them to confront the unconscionable racism and cruelty of anti-treaty rights activists is moving, to say the least. Even more lasting in my mind, however, are the images she conveys in regard to the courage and the resilience of the Ojibwe people who overcame that hate. Moreover, the way she situates the story in the context of a renewal of Ojibwe spiritualism, the prophecy of the seventh fire, compellingly links contemporary sovereignty struggles to a deep, abiding, and enduring sense of indigenous peoplehood. And then there's Usual and Accustomed Places, which focuses on the 19th century history of fishing rights here in the Pacific Northwest, a film that carries additional resonance because Sandy herself serves as the narrator. I had the good fortune of hosting Sandy and Yasu at Miami University, where I taught prior to moving to North Carolina. And though 10 years have already gone by since that visit, it's hard to believe that, I will not soon forget the impact Usual and Accustomed Places had on my students that day. Sandy's visit to Miami University also led to another critically important film that was made in collaboration with the Miami Nation of Oklahoma, entitled Miamiaki Imamwichiki, The Miami Awakening. It tells the inspiring story of the Miamia Center's language and cultural revitalization efforts. For those of you who don't know, the Miami had been almost completely obliterated through a series of dispossessions and relocations from Indiana to Kansas and finally to northeastern Oklahoma. They lost their last native speaker in 1968, and the language fell into dormancy. Some would mistakenly say it was dying by the 1990s. I can still hear Darrell Baldwin, the director of the Miamia Center, and someone who essentially took it upon himself to revitalize the language through his own family, telling me how thankful he was that Sandy and Yasu collaborated with them on the project. Unlike other filmmakers they had encountered in the past, Sandy's and Yasu's approach was profoundly engaged and sensitive. They immediately established rapport and trust with the Miami community. In short, Darrell said, Sandy and Yasu got it. By showcasing the value and effectiveness of language and cultural revitalization, Miamiaki Imamwichiki has helped and will continue to help ensure that future generations of Miami people will benefit from the Miamia Center's important work. In fact, I would argue that the film has and will continue to serve as not only a symbol, but as a vehicle for contemporary assertions of Miami sovereignty, of Miami peoplehood. This is the work that that Sandy's work does for the Miamis and other Native people. In fact, Sandy, I would say, accomplished a similar feat in her beautiful House of Welcome, which is on one level the story of the construction of Evergreen State College's Longhouse, and on another level an homage to Lumbee community leader Mary Hilaire, another member of the Greatest Generation, by the way. By making these films and others that address issues of pressing concern, whether it's land rights, as in the heart of Big Mountain, or identity and acknowledgement with Princess Angeline, Sandy has contributed to social, political, and economic change by educating, raising awareness, and motivating. When you see her films and hear her speak, you're reminded of the sanctity of treaties, of environmental justice, and of the value of listening to and learning from history. And you're also reminded of everything about Native America that's worth celebrating, that's worth fighting for. You learn about Native humor through her brilliant film about Oneida, Mohawk, and Creek comedian Charlie Hill, about innovative and boundary-defying musicianship and artistry through the lives of Native jazz saxophonist Jim Pepper and Osage prima ballerina Maria Tallchief. Indeed, I think that Sandy Osawa, the activist, and Sandy Osawa, the filmmaker, are inseparable. Consider, for instance, how she articulated the purpose of her work, and by extension, the work of all Native filmmakers. By claiming and defining our own history, Osawa explains, I believe we can more easily build a better life in all other areas. I think media has long been an overlooked part of our struggles, and true sovereignty cannot exist until we are truly able to tell our own stories. Through her films, Sandy Osawa tells the truth. In fact, she speaks truth to power, and in this instance, it's no cliche. And as I'll suggest here in a moment, she always has. Now, quite a bit of what I've shared with you may sound familiar. After all, the Sandy Osawa most people know is Sandy Osawa, the documentary filmmaker. What I'd like to do with the remainder of my time is share a little bit about the Sandy Osawa I've come to know through my work on 20th century American Indian politics and activism. But even more important, I want you to understand that I would not know what I know about American Indian politics and activism without Sandy. Danica shared my list of publications. None of them would exist without Sandy. Sandy appears literally in those pages, in all of them, and through her spirit and her good counsel in which she has taught me in all of them. I'm talking, of course, about her lived experiences, and what she did and what I've written about in regard to what she's done. But I'm also talking about her wisdom, her insight, her close readings and reflections, and her constructive criticism, the time that she's given me over the years. I can't even begin to tell you how much I've benefited from her insistence that I try harder, that I dig deeper, and that I look closer. And she did all that without having to say it, just through the conversation itself. That's the message that she never fails to convey. I first spoke with Sandy in 2003 when I interviewed her for my book, Native Activism in Cold War America. It's a book that's meant to decenter without diminish the militant activism associated with the American Indian movement by exploring broader, deeper, and more nuanced struggles for sovereignty from the mid-1950s to the late 1960s. In pursuing this project, I became increasingly interested in the different forms activism takes and who counts as being an activist. And that's how I really met Sandy Osawa for the first time. In fact, I like to think that I've known her since 1962, even though I wasn't born yet. That was the year she first attended something called the Workshop on American Indian Affairs. I'll just let you try to find her in this picture, and then I'll show you later. The workshop was an innovative 6-week summer program for Native college students held for most of its history on the campus of the University of Colorado, and it played a critically important role in the development of the Native youth movement of the 1960s. Now, I could go on and on about the workshops, but let me cut to the chase. The organizers of the workshops, and especially Cherokee anthropologist Robert K. Thomas, who you're seeing to the left, thought of them as an intellectual training ground for a generation of Native thinkers, a cadre of young nationalists who would rejuvenate the tribal sovereignty movement. The workshops were really about raising Indian people to what Standing Rock Sioux luminary Vine Deloria Jr. referred to as a new conception of ourselves. In the parlance of contemporary American Indian and Indigenous studies, they were about decolonizing the mind through the application of history and social scientific theory to Indian people's everyday lives and to structures of subjection. Consider just a few of the essay questions that Sandy and her fellow students were asked to address at the workshops. Describe the consequences for the world and social relations of a folk people under a colonial administration. This is 1962. Using examples relate colonialism to your community. How did nationalism come about? And what are some of the advantages of nationalism? I sort of follow that with, in parentheses, hint, hint. And then finally, and this is a question I think could show up on a final exam today. All of them could. Compare the structure and consequences of colonialism or minority group status in one of the following: India, Kenya, Ghana, Maori in New Zealand, Aboriginal people in the Philippines, with the structure and consequences of the relationship between either American Indians or a specific group in the wider American society. This is what Sandy was exposed to at the workshops. Now, let's listen to a few of the responses students gave to these kinds of questions. I'd never before thought of the Indians as compared to colonialism. I thought colonialism existed only in the older countries like Southern Europe or in places such as Africa, wrote Frank Dukpu, a Hopi student at the workshop. Clyde Warrior, a Ponca who would become a central figure in the youth movement throughout the 60s, observed, another thing I learned is that all over the world, tribal peoples are coming in contact with the outside world, and basically they all have the same reactions. And Bruce Wilkie, a Makah, concluded, as long as there is a colonial agency set up to administer to Indian affairs, there will always be an Indian social problem. That is to say, the Indian problem isn't the Indians' problem. It's a structural problem. Among the most thoughtful, the most introspective, and the most prescient of the students was, of course, a young Makah woman from Lewis and Clark College named Sandra Johnson. Sandy wrote a great many profound essays as a participant in the 1962 and 1964 workshops. I know because I've read them all. But I'd like to highlight just a couple. I chose this first one for inclusion in my latest book, Say We Are Nations, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press this month. Imagine yourself looking over Sandy's shoulder as she responds to this question: what do you hope your community will be like 20 years from now, and why? Here's what she wrote. 20 years from now, I'd like our community to be self-supporting and responsible. I'd like to see a few businesses controlled by Indian people, and those white people who do own businesses, I'd like to see a corporate tax placed on. An effective, efficient tribal government would be wonderful to visualize. As for the physical features, I'd like to see a sewage system, paved streets, and an adequate housing program. A Clean Up the Town campaign would be needed. Law and order are the big questions. And think about what she's saying in light of violence against women. I'd like to see local effective law and order, or an outside appointed policeman. I don't think it desirable to grow up in a community where everything's allowed, where drinking is the rule and not the exception. The local parents also express this view, although they never quite bring it up at the meetings. I'd like to see this because I consider these goals all desirable. Furthermore, I believe most local people want this. And although I have made no scientific survey, the general consensus seems to be, it'd be nice, but it'll never happen. A real fatalistic, non-trying point of view, although it's understandable. Being realistic, I would say that it will all start with a few individuals to get the ball rolling. If Bruce Wilkie gets the chairman's position, that'll be a big start. To get the council's approval will be the difficult part. Every change will be slow and will be by individuals. A college education will be necessary for some of our tribe, and a growing ambition. I have no concrete answers other than to go into the community, find out if their wants are like mine, and try to accomplish it. Much study on my part will be necessary, and thanks to the workshop, my interest has been aroused. Boy, was it ever. I think this excerpt speaks directly to Sandy's sensitivity, her insight, her prescience. It speaks to the theme of awakening. We hear a young mind at work, and we hear her puzzling through and anticipating her life's work. We can hear her imagining what it means to say we are nations. And what I especially appreciate as someone interested in the intellectual history of this era is that we gain an opportunity to hear someone seeking answers to questions, not someone who has it all neatly figured out, because ideas don't work that way. In fact, it's the incompleteness of the intellectual struggle itself, the very in-process nature of making sense of the past, of the present, and of the future of tribal sovereignty that most interests me about this period, and I think what she most powerfully gives us insight into. Speaking of which, I also want to point out how Sandy helped me work through this document and to discern its many meanings. When I was writing Say We Are Nations, I knew I wanted to include something about the workshop, and I also knew that Sandy's was one of the voices that had to be present in it. So I reached out to her, and I asked permission to include some of her writings. Being the incredibly gracious person that she is, she agreed. And I proceeded to share with her all of the writings that I had gathered in the archives, along with my ideas for how I might integrate them into the volume. What followed was a typical Sandy Osawa tour de force, as she offered her thoughts on the essays, reflected on how she reads them now, which I thought was quite insightful in its own right, and then methodically responded to how I was or was not adequately contextualizing and interpreting them. Just as she had been doing since our first conversation more than 10 years before, Sandy taught me how to see, how to think, how to understand. Among the most important insights I gained this time around was just how it was that she and others wrote and how they translated their writings into action, constituted small a activism, small r radicalism by effecting real grassroots change. Consider, she said, that it didn't take them 20 years to realize the vision she articulated for her community. It took 2. Consider that Sandy went on to serve as director of the War on Poverty's Neighborhood Youth Corps and Head Start programs, and then the entire Community Action Program at Nia Bay. There she inaugurated revolutionary changes in the form of providing incentives for K through 12 students to learn Makah language and culture in the context of summer programs, and to pay elders to serve as teachers in the Head Start preschool program. Bruce Wilkie did indeed become the Makah's general manager shortly after Sandy wrote the essay, and later served as the executive director of the National Congress of American Indians. These were no small changes, particularly given the context in which they happened. They made the impossible possible. Now, I'd like to turn to a second excerpt from a paper she wrote collaboratively with a few other students at the 1964 workshop. The instructors, it appears, asked the students to reflect on the future of Indian identity. Now, keep in mind that Sandy was writing during the height of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was, without question, a time of crushing conformity in the United States generally, and one of extreme anti-tribalism and assimilationist pressure in Native America. Here's what Sandy wrote on behalf of her group. What the writers of this paper sense is a clear and present danger as the white culture extends its influence further and further into the Indian way of life. It's not that Indians reject white culture per se, it's that they reject white culture when they're forced to adapt to it by losing what they are and what they value. One does not painlessly reject oneself. For white men who fail to grasp this, one should ask them what they would do. If it became necessary for them to live under Russian dominance, many would cry, "Better dead than red." And yet another battle between the Reds and whites is being fought within our own borders. Given this different context, it may be easier for white citizens to understand our cry, which would sound more like, "Better red than dead." This excerpt, along with the preceding one, is important because it allows us to see the central place Sandy holds among a generation that said, "Enough's enough," to racism, to ethnocentrism, to all forms of anti-Indianism, a generation that transcended the seductive but ultimately destructive binaries of authenticity that were bent on portraying Indian identity as anachronistic and on consigning sovereign nationhood to the past. But Sandy and her generation did not settle for refusal alone. Instead, they articulated and acted to realize a different future, a positive one, predicated on the idea of a greater Indian America. Sandy's generation founded or served central roles in organizations such as the National Indian Youth Council, with its newspaper Americans Before Columbus, and in the National Congress of American Indians. They became tribal leaders. They emerged as influential innovators in the fields of art, education, law, and medicine. And Sandy not only became involved in the war on poverty within her own community, but also the fishing rights struggle that gripped the Pacific Northwest. Images from what you're seeing at the bottom there. Her activism continued during the 1970s and after, when she made the decision to study film at UCLA, founded Upstream Productions, and began making cutting-edge documentaries about issues of profound importance in Indian country. I think we probably take it for granted today that Native people will be involved in the development and production of films about their communities and histories, that Indian people will tell their own stories, as Sandy herself put it. But we would do well not to forget that Sandy worked in a much less hospitable environment, and that she courageously blazed a trail for others to follow. Indeed, Sandy has been an independent producer longer than any other American Indian in the country. She was the first Native American independent to produce for commercial television, and she has, quite deservedly, garnered innumerable awards and acclaim for her work. Now, I have a lot more I'd like to say and to share about Sandy, about her life, her work, and her many contributions. But I guess that what I'd like to leave you with is the idea that she's been a candle in the dark, and that I am profoundly thankful for how she continues to light the way. Through her life's work and all the lives she has touched through it, Sandy Osawa has made and continues to make this world a better place. For these reasons, I cannot think of a more deserving recipient of an occasion such as this, a person more deserving of having their life and work celebrated than Sandy Osawa, a woman who stands among the greatest of Native America's greatest generation.